So thank you, Manuel. Thank you, everyone, all for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure and honor every time to come here to this living screensaver of a environment. The talk I have prepared for you is thus. Many of you are familiar, I should think, with the Shanxi Pod City near New Taipei City in Taiwan. This future city was late for its own birth, which was 1978. Originally planned as a vacation resort for U.S. soldiers, the project was doomed by a series of mysterious car accidents and abandoned in 1980. The future lasted only 2 years. However, when demolition work began in 2008, it was discovered that not one, but 5 species of orchid mantis, as yet unknown to science, had overtaken the ruins and multiplied to a population of an estimated 10 million insect inhabitants. Above ground, underground, inside the structures, in between them, no one knows how or why. Etymologists observe that the unintended orchid mantis civilization has developed an incredibly complex division of labor, not only within the same species, but between different species as well. These include systems for food capture, nest construction, and stigmergic communication between individuals and groups that have never been observed anywhere before. The appearance of the mantis has coincided as well with the proliferation of a new subspecies of orchid flowers, which the insects resemble and from which they get their name. Now, orchids don't usually grow in this part of Taiwan, but today they thrive in the unusual labyrinthine cold and darkness provided by the mantis's own architecture. The future city, you see, is not for us. The Anthropocene, the reframing of the earth in the image of industrial modernity, will be short-lived, a geopolitical instant more than a slow geologic era. Humans are slowly vanishing, even as their aggregate biomass continues to swell. Their cities are not their own. They are building habitats for other forms of life. Humans are the tools wielded by those other forms. The extraordinary architecture of Shanxi, that is, the systems built by the orchid mantis on top of and in between the UFO pods, has become, in a short 30 years, a precious future archaeological resource. It's not a failed future, but a successful one. It's our future. We are already its present, we who are displaced by the orchid mantis. So my remarks today are drawn from a series of texts and some new passages written since I've gotten here based on conversations with friends of you. They're all post-Stack. The Stack is this, on Software and Sovereignty is the book coming up at MIT Press in the fall. And what I wanted to share with you today in the spirit of EGS is newer work, less polished, less formulated, and hopefully more amenable to discussion. So I want to talk about some questions regarding matter and intelligence, sensing and sensation, synthetic intelligence, all of which are core issues of the next book. So one first thing to begin with is a notion that the threshold by which any particular composition of matter can be said to be intelligent has less to do with reflecting humanness back at us than with testing our own abilities to conceive the variety of what intelligence might be, with our ability to discern patterns from all of the noise. And getting this wrong, getting the practical epistemology of synthetic intelligence wrong has concrete implications for us on many levels. One misrecognition is the all too facile distinction between human and non-human. When that facile distinction is made carelessly, as it often is, when non-human has something available only by anthropomorphizing it or turning it into a definitional game, as for OOO, or for the concept of corporate personhood as the signal accomplishment of the weak program of new materialism. The other is what in philosophy we call the Anthropocentric Fallacy. I find that you can tell a lot about someone's materialism by how they think and talk about real matter itself. its importance, its mutability, its agency, its muteness, its historicity, its logistics, its physics, as a culinary materialism, a cannibal materialism, or otherwise. Now, one form of intelligence for matter is what we call computation, which is something I would argue we discovered rather than invented, but as of yet have constructed only a few measly appliances with which we try to wrangle it, namely the von Neumann architecture machine, which made the virtual Turing machine into a real thing. It didn't have to be that way, but it was. Seymour Cray, for example, certainly had other ideas for this architecture. The point is that the most salient universality of computation is not necessarily the absolutely infinite mathematical machine, as Turing had already demonstrated, but towards something like a universal machine technology and a local instrument by which the centripetal translations of work and event and movement, of ideation, into self-similar, modular, replicable programs is made so. The common denominator of that reduction, in essence, makes computation generic, plastic, and extensible on the local anthroeconomic level. Now, as this hardware became the basis of this self-replicating universality of what we call algorithmic globalization, a condition of the platforms that we have today, but tomorrow certainly of something else, what Giuseppe Longo calls the next machine. The replication of matter, especially in the parthenogenic replication of the von Neumann machine, is not the same, of course, as the replication of the algorithm as an instrumental agent. And neither are the same as the chemical recombitancy of matter itself. That is a much deeper and richer thing. But it does provide we primates a feeble glimpse into the potential of atomic level design. As for matter, the universe, as we know, is mostly hydrogen, some helium, a little bit of oxygen, miscellaneous other things. And this would mean that everything material that has been or could be in the future is a combination of a very limited set of atomic modules, setting aside the subatomic realm. And this is borne out from what we know from astrobiology and astrochemistry. What we know is what there is. But this should not discourage us. We have existing models for simple nanotechnologies doing incredible feats of recomposition with very little energy. Ribosomes, for example, turn food into babies. This is nanotechnology. It's the same stuff rearranged. And as this elemental recombitancy may be closed, it is in that way locally universal and still, for the most part, untapped. But more difference or less. Drexler's gray goose scenario, an idea of repeating molecular machines at a molecular scale, making more and more of themselves, exponentially eating it all, turning the whole planet into an extra medium khaki-colored mush, is allegorical perhaps of this self-replicant algorithmic metaprogram using the media of globalization to homogenize the stuff of all things. This is the bad news about closed set recombitancy at our scale. But negentropy, moving to entropy, is not the only immediate course that computational chemistry can take. The opposite, and the blooming of weird varieties of generic sludge, exotic plastics, from oil, for example. The speculative chemistry works on matter, how it works on matter itself may be the path away from the gray goo of the present material condition, not its apotheosis. So, how to map technological material recombitancy as a theory of the subject against, for example, the tropes of eros and thanatos is tricky. Freud barely had Darwin, let alone genetics and the rest, and so probably should be read a bit more like one reads the Greeks. Organic versus inorganic is a minor issue. Something having or not having, whether or not something has or doesn't have carbon is really beside the point. A desire to melt back into the inorganic and to be overcome and overwhelmed and absorbed by matter itself may be a way of encountering and even desiring death, but it is actually a very everyday occurrence. It's not a sad destiny to be interwoven with alien matter, and the key point of it is that other diagrams are possible. Anatomic, economic. This human body and this earthly landscape of matter are only the default settings. They are not destiny. Chemistry may drive the most radical forms of the political imaginary. A culinary materialism, as Reza says, yes. A rubbing the clinamen raw. Now, any instance, singular or plural of matter, particle or wave, is potentially identified by massive universal addressing systems in which the mapping and linking of Avogadro's number of hyaccities may be allotted to every user. The global credential of such addresses subdivides heterogeneous territories, hard and soft, Hertzian space and carbon space, into a disintegrated communicative array, an atmospheric metropolis built of digit strings. Here, the addressability of physical objects, withdrawn into their specific enumeration, is itself overmatched by the addressability of abstract relations between objects and their compositing and sorting into higher order sets, any of which also addresses and is addressed by one another in a process that continues. This places micron-scale processing of Shannon information into irregular meshes of network matter and substantialized abstractions toward an absolute communication and absolute incommunication at once. As multiple maps and geographies name and number intersecting territories and enroll addressees into assemblages that may be effectively invisible to one another. Any addressee is compelled to appear to one platform of ubiquitous addressability. And this compulsion may also guarantee its disappearance from alternate addressable landscapes to which it may be all but invisible. And so in the end, the mastery of master perspectives is overcome by the proliferation of other master perspectives that cannot recognize, let alone contain, one another. And that inhumanity of addressability, above and below scales of perception, refers to another intelligence of matter and also pretends, perhaps, forms of macroeconomic revolutions of sorts. As we know, in the 60s and 70s, socialist cyberneticians tried to solve what Hayek called the socialist pricing problem. I had to bring up Hayek, I'm sorry. By using what was then supercomputing, but is today perhaps enough processing power to run a good alarm clock. What is the socialist pricing problem? Well, as you know, markets send and receive pricing signals. They are information processing machines, what Hayek called catallaxy. But today we have lots of examples where computational platforms, where platforms served by a more robust computation, realize a kind of synthetic catallaxy. The price signaling in real time is not a problem for the centralized planned economies of Walmart's supply chain or Amazon's long-tail pricing algorithms or Google's user attention auctions. So not only could such platforms, or really future better versions of them, be used to solve the, quote, socialist pricing problem, they could also be used to solve the capitalist pricing problem. Now, the capitalist pricing problem comes from how markets exclude so-called externalities in transaction price signals. The ultimate ecological or public health cost of that gallon of gasoline is not reflected in its price. And so its price is just as distorted as that of an old school planned economy. Undistorting it is essential. So this positive variation on an algorithmic governance might be one in which various deep universal addressing systems, IPv6 offers 10 to the 23 addresses per person, blockchain, Bitcoin blockchains have 2 to the 256 possible private keys, might allow us to somehow identify and trace the particular effects and ramifications of a particular translation and transaction. all along the sourcing and supply chain, use chain, disposal chain, and to adjudicate and to enforce that its actual cost is reflected in the transactional price, because there are no true externalities, because there is no outside to put them. Deep incentives to make negative externalities, like carbon, for example, more scarce, must be built into the central commanding infrastructure of the economy, ideally at the level of its information processing, that is, its price. Temporary autonomous zones are cute and fun, but to paraphrase Nick Chernysek, Goldman Sachs is not worried about open source urban gardens or occupying offices of art school administrators. Deep addressability, however, and more pervasive and accountable supercomputing contribute perhaps to a synthetic catallaxy that could realize a shift in structure in the platform itself, not just in its visible cultural effects. So Tim O'Reilly's riff that the killer app of the Internet of Things is insurance may be a more provocative notion than he realizes if taken to mean primarily the precise long-term risk models of enterprise reinsurance that underwrite, or better refuse to underwrite, any large-scale capital project, like extracting carbon deposits from under the ground, for example. So algorithmic governance should be able to enforce rules but also to learn. Blockchain advocates evangelize its decentralized architecture, which is likely a key means to ensure that accountability. But the transposition of that into a commanding armature means centralization. It also means getting over the fact that platforms are both centralizing and decentralizing at the same time. So I'm not arguing to say, making an argument that is pro-platform or anti-platform, either as being a good or an evil, but I am arguing nor am I arguing that they're neutral. They aren't, and it's the lack of neutrality that makes them useful as geopolitical design tools. That is, put differently, the critique of infrastructure is essential, but it must also rotate into infrastructure scale design models if it is serious, not just posturing. And for this, I think it's useful to think in terms of totalities because they provide a framework for considering the distributed agency, subjectivity, causality, and effect at once. And again, there are no externalities because, for better or worse, there is no outside to put them. Now, the question of algorithmic governance, I think, is afforded and staged a number of misunderstandings. When I teach the history of algorithms and thought to my students in the art department at UC San Diego, I begin with some of John Cage's works and the instruction logics of these, the ways in which they modulate determination and chance, the history of cooking recipes, and so forth. Then do we move into the essential role of women programmers from Ada Byron to Grace Murray Hopper, and so hopefully demystify and disenchant algorithms so that the rules that they inscribe might be rewritten. My ongoing feud, if you like, with Patrick, but also with some other people on the other side of the aisle, is that they're both wrong in that they fervently believe that algorithmic governance and infrastructures is tied inevitably and inextricably to neoliberal capitalism. For Patrick, that's good. For others, that's bad. But it's simply not true. All of the interesting design and philosophical problems begin by recognizing the contingency of their relative adherence or separation. By making and thinking about forms of planetary scale computational economics that are alien to any economic pathologies as we know it, that collapse dichotomies between central and decentral, between top-down and bottom-up, and so forth. However, pushback against that disenchantment, against a mystified and demonized mathematics, is not only, I think, a distaste for certain forms of financialization and a preference for romantic verse, for example. It's a bulwark on behalf of a pre-Copernican, deeply conservative humanist exceptionalism, even a humanist fundamentalism. Of the latter, one of the most difficult shifts in our thinking will need to be around who and what is a user, and who and what is sovereign as a user. States have citizens, markets have homo economicus, and platforms have users. It doesn't work to treat one as if it were the other. Now, the same person or thing might be all three at different times, but the governing issues, the organizational issues, and the design issues are different. The generic universality of platforms makes them formally open to all users, human, non-human, inhuman, alike. If the user's actions are interoperable with the protocols of the platform, then in principle, it can communicate with its systems and with its economies. And for this, platforms generate user identities, whether they're desired or not. Anything that can initiate interactions with the platform can be a user, and the platform may see them and interact back with them without knowing or caring who or what they are. Platforms don't care if the state sees you as an illegal immigrant or if the market sees you as an externality. Platforms ultimately don't care if the user is animal, vegetable, or mineral. All users have platform sovereignty. In security speak, a user is credentialized by three qualifications: something you know, a password; something you are, like a fingerprint; and something you have, like a key card. If someone or something can be, have, and know, it can be a user. A trading algorithm, a driverless car, a sans-papier arrivé, a chemical reaction triggering a threshold event in an environmental sensor embedded on a leaf in a rainforest, all users. The user is an open position. And so, to develop political and economic models for these, that user and the conceptualization of that user is inseparable philosophically and technologically from a reconception of the human as a kind of user and of the user as something that is not necessarily human. One can expect pushback, as fervent as it is irrational. There are some affinities with technology, however fictitious or bizarre, that are thought to embody either the essence of a creationist order, such as food, or the personal human mastery over machines, such as the car. I would go so far as to predict that there will be a movement to identify human-driven automobiles as a type of arms, and that the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, now used to shield gun owners from obvious liabilities and to protect their sense of personal dominion, will be flown to keep human beings behind steering wheels. Your life may be ended by someone encased in a 2-ton steel box, careening down the asphalt vista, trying to prove a point about how technology will never capture his natural humanity. So, while all this stages the death of the user, in one sense, the eclipse of a certain resolute humanism, they do so because they also bring the multiplication and proliferation of other kinds of non-human or inhuman or exohuman users, including sensors, financial algorithms, robots from nanometric to landscape scale, and so forth. Any combination of which might enter into a relationship as part of a composite user. So as robotics and cloud hardware of all scales blend into a common category of machine, it will be unclear in general everyday human-robotic interaction whether one is encountering a fully autonomous, partially autonomous, or completely human-piloted synthetic intelligence. Everyday interactions will replay the Turing test over and over. Is there a person behind this machine, and if so, how much? In time, the answer might matter less, and the postulation of human or even carbon-based life as the threshold measure of intelligence and as the qualifying gauge of a political ethics may seem like tasteless vestigial racism, replaced by, we hope, less anthropocentric frames of reference. The little boy, for example, in Steven Spielberg's AI, artificial intelligence, wants to be a real boy with all his little metal heart, while Skynet in the Terminator movies is obsessed with the genocide of humans. So despite all the Copernican traumas that modernity has brought, some forms of humanism and their companion figures of humanity still presume and demand their perch in the center of the cosmic court. I argue that we should abandon the conceit that a true artificial intelligence arriving at sentience or sapience must care deeply about humanity, us specifically, as the focus of its knowing and desire. Perhaps the real nightmare, even worse than the one in which the big machine wants to kill you, is the one in which it sees you as irrelevant, or not even as a discrete thing to know. Worse than being seen as an enemy is not being seen at all. And perhaps that's what we really fear about AI. Or, for example, let's consider the Turing test in a bit more detail. Turing, of course, proposed his test as a variation on a popular parlor game in which two hidden contestants, a woman, player A, and a man, player B, try to convince a third that he or she is a woman by their written responses to leading questions. To win, one of the players must convincingly be who they really are, whereas the other must try to pass as another gender. Turing describes his own variation as one in which, quote, a computer takes the place of player A, unquote, which in the original imitation game scenario that he describes in his 1950 paper is a woman. And so a literal reading would suggest that in his version, the computer is not just pretending to be a human, but pretending to be a woman. It must pass as a she. And I think it matters quite a lot if only one player is faking, or if both are, or if neither are. And now that we give the computer a seat, we may have it pretending to be a woman, along with a man pretending to be a woman, both trying to trick the interrogator into figuring out which is a man and which is a woman. Or perhaps a computer pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman, along with a man pretending to be a woman, or even a computer pretending to be a woman, pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman. In the real world, of course, we have all of the above. And as we know, the mathematician himself also had to pass. In his case, as a straight man in a society that criminalized homosexuality. Upon discovery that he was not what he appeared to be, he was forced to undergo horrific medical treatments known as chemical castration. And ultimately, the physical and emotional pain was too great, and he committed suicide. The episode was a grotesque tribute to a man whose recent contributions to defeating Hitler's military was still a state secret. Turing was only recently given posthumous pardon, but the tens of thousands of other British men sentenced under similar law have not. So one notes a sour, ironic correspondence between asking an AI to pass the test in order to qualify as intelligent, to pass as human intelligence, with Turing's own need to hide his homosexuality and to pass as a straight man. The demands of both bluffs are unnecessary and profoundly unfair. The demands of these bluffs also damage those on the front lines asked to police them. Blade Runner, as you recall, hinges on the Voight-Kampff empathy test, which differentiates humans from replicants. And in this world, Turing test thresholds are weaponized, lest replicants pass as humans and trespass beyond their station. By the film's conclusion, Deckard, who himself may or may not be a replicant, develops empathy for the replicant's desire for, quote, more life. And arguably they too, at least Roy Batty, the Rutger Hauer character, seem to have empathy for Deckard's own dilemma. His dilemma and ours is that in order to enforce the gap between the human and the AI, defined by empathy or lack thereof, Deckard must suppress the empathy that supposedly makes him uniquely human. By forcing him to quash his own identification with the replicants that supposedly cannot have empathy in return, the principle of differentiation upon which the anthropocentric fallacy for AI is precariously perched requires its own violation in order to maintain itself. The harm in this is also in the loss of all that we disallow ourselves to discover and understand when we insist on protecting beliefs we know to be false. In the 1950 essay, Turing offers several rebuttals to his speculative AI, including a striking comparison with earlier objections to Copernican astronomy. The advent of robust inhuman AI will provide, I think, a similar disenchantment, Copernican traumas that abolish the false centrality and specialness of human thought, not its dignity, and all of which are priceless accomplishments. Should complex AI arrive, it will not be human-like unless we insist that it pretend to be so, because one assumes we would do so with the idea that intelligence could be both real and inhuman at the same time is morally and or psychologically intolerable. So that appreciation should account for two different but related understandings. The first of which would recognize that intelligence and knowledge is distributed among multiple positions and forms of life, both similar and dissimilar to one another. This is not to say that nothing is true and everything is permutation, rather that no single chemical anatomical disposition has a privileged monopoly on how to think intelligently. Put differently, either there is no such thing as general intelligence, rather only situated genres of limited intelligence, in which case the human is among a variety of these, or there is such a thing as general intelligence, but that its very generality, its accomplishments of generic abstraction, are agnostic as to what sort of entity might mediate them. Either way, human sapience is special but not unique. This appreciation would see AI as a regular phenomenon, not so unlike other ways that human intelligence is located among other modalities of intelligence, such as animal cognition. Second, our appreciation, or the second understanding would be one in which our appreciation of that wider continuum would also recognize that the potential advent of AGI, artificial general intelligence, is rather novel, as yet unexplained, and will demand encounters between humans and mechanically situated intelligence that are unprecedented. And for this, AI is highly irregular. Both of these are true, and it may only be that by understanding one is how we can really accomplish the other. That is, it may only be by confronting what is genuinely new about non-carbon-based intelligence, possessing such ability and autonomy, that we will be able to fully recognize the continuum of intelligence with which ours has always been embedded. Put simply, it may be that one indirect outcome of the philosophical discussion about AI is a wider appreciation of non-human animal cognition and subjectivity. In some discourses, this conjunction is domesticated under the sign of an all-too-pat posthumanism, or transcendentally anthropocentric transhumanism. Variations of the former still have much to offer regardless, and while variations of the latter should, but probably don't in the end. And the issue here is more the limiting contextualization of dominant forms of humanism than a relinquishment of what the human and the inhuman is and can be within this expanded continuum. Reza Negarestani retains this point in his essay on the labor of the inhuman, insisting that the easy nomination of certain forms of thought and experience that seem to fall outside of various contingent norms, moral or mechanical, as quote-unquote non-human, is to discard at the outset the integral mutability of the human as a philosophical and engineering problem. That is, the relative uniqueness of human sapience is not what locks down the human as a single fixed thing with essential boundaries. Rather, it's what makes the human as such into an open project of continual refashioning, unverifiable by essence or telos. And in considering that capacity in regards to AI, what might qualify as a general intelligence is not duty-bound to species or to phylum. What it provides for it is its capacity for abstraction. Ray Brassiere suggests that in the ability of an organism, any organism, however primitive, to map its own surroundings, particularly in relation to the basic terms of friend, food, or foe, is a primordial abstraction from which we do not graduate so much as learn to develop into something like reason and its local human variations. And in this way, mapping abstraction is not an early stage through which things pass on their way towards more complex forms of intelligence. Rather, it's a general principle of that complexification. Like protozoa and their ganglia feeling about to figure out what's out there, or like humans looking and tasting and imagining patterns, Today's forms of AI are sometimes augmented by various technologies of machine vision that allow them to see and to sense the world out there and to abstract the forms of a mechanically embodied intelligence, both deliberately programmed for them and emerging unexpectedly. So exactly where to draw the line of distinction between the accomplishments of an AI that exemplify general intelligence, now operating through a new medium, on the one hand, or a specific projection of a locally human intelligence programmed into its cognitive prosthesis on the other, is unknown and unknowable at present. But again, one may precondition the other. In the meantime, we can at least speculate on how we would be able to know where to draw that distinction. And considerations towards this include how we attempt to program stupidity into AI, and how we attempt to view them with what we take to be our most rarefied forms of ethical reasoning on the other. When one of these dictates and when one of these dictates the other, this is a moment of weirdness worth honing in on. How so? In AI research, there is an important distinction made between what's called artificial idiocy and artificial stupidity. Artificial stupidity is achieved by throttling the performance of systems so that it's easier and more naturalistic for human interactions. For example, who might expect certain variances in textures. At full capacity, the chess program on your phone can beat you every time. But what fun is that? Artificial idiocy, on the other hand, is when a system is catastrophically successful in carrying out its program up to and past beyond an idiotic extreme. The paperclip maximizer is a famous thought experiment describing an AI that is so successful at carrying out its program to turn all available material into paperclips that ultimately it eats the earth and destroys humanity in the process. So many clips, so little paper to clip. Here, the AI goes wrong not because it was throttled or because it malfunctioned or because it hates us, but because it does exactly what we trained it to do, and that turned out to be very bad for us. And as usual, science fiction is the canary in the coal mine here. Consider the HAL 9000 in Kubrick and Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Really a drama, I think, about HAL's furtive relationship to the alien intelligence, more about that than humanity's relationship to either one of those characters. So after some obscure, unexplained deliberations, HAL, who has been, we assume, trained according to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, and with the best faculties of ethical reasoning we can manage, nevertheless comes to the conclusion that the human astronauts should be eliminated. The mission to contact the alien near Jupiter is just too important to allow for the interference. The AI turns out to be the deepest deep ecologist. Now, are HAL's actions a form of artificial stupidity or artificial idiocy or neither of these? Is this a glitch, a breakdown, a final error? Or is this a lucid, inevitable conclusion of the moral reasoning we have programmed into HAL, a reason now trained back upon us? So in comparison with the robot ethicists who consider how to train military bots in the catechism of just war, are HAL's ethical abstractions a violation of that doctrinal program or its fulfillment? So back to the Turing test for a moment. Will the wish to define the very existence of AI in relationships to its ability to mimic how humans think that humans think, will this be looked back upon as a weird form of speciesism or racism? The legacy of this mistake also sent older AI research down a disappointingly fruitless path of hoping to recreate human minds from the top down. It just doesn't work. As Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, now the director of research at Google, remind us in their essential AI textbook, biomorphic imitation is not how we design complex technologies. Airplanes don't fly like birds fly, and we certainly don't try to trick birds into thinking that airplanes are birds in order to test whether these planes really are flying machines. So why do it for AI? Today, the vast majority of AI research is not focused on the Turing test as anything like a central criterion of success, and yet in our general discourse about AI, the test's anthropocentrism holds such conceptual importance. Like the animals talking like teenagers in a Disney movie, other minds are conceivable mostly by way of puerile ventriloquism. Each of us, as said, will be confronted with various seemingly intelligent machines, some of which are remotely controlled or programmed by people, some of which may be largely autonomous, and most of which will be a hybrid of the two, both human and not human at the same time. The question of locating intelligence will not be a question with a binary answer, so we should stop asking it that way. It's better to examine how identification works from our side of the conversation. For example, it's clearly much easier to make a robot that a human believes to have emotions, and for which in turn a human has emotions, than it is to make a robot that actually has emotions. This emotional infill on the part of the human who may feel love or hate or comfort from the AI, is but reading cues, not detecting feelings. What seems like empathy is really a one-way projection, mistaken for recognition, like the Turing Test itself, and not based on any mutual solidarity. Another harm in this epistemic misrecognition is the perpetuation of a relationship to technology that has brought us to the precipice of a sixth great extinction. Arguably, the Anthropocene itself is due less to technology run amok than to the humanist legacy that understands the world as having been given for our needs and created in our image. We still see this everywhere, and this is why we can't have nice things. A well-known American thought leader in the world of design, who go unnamed, recently wrote, quote, "It's time to invent a world where machines are subservient to the needs and wishes of humanity," unquote. If you think so, I invite you to Google pig decapitating machine, and then let's talk about inventing worlds in which machines are wholly subservient to the human wishes. One wonders whether it is only from a society that once gave theological and legislative comfort to chattel slavery that this particular claim could be made in 2015 with such satisfied naivete. This is the sentiment, this philosophy of technology exactly, that is the basic algorithm of the Anthropocenic predicament. It's time to move on. This pretentious folklore is too expensive. For thinking animals, seeing and making things is easy. But making copies of what is seen and made is hard. For machines, on the other hand, making copies is a way of seeing and is much easier than thinking, or perhaps is a kind of thinking. And as for the media technologies that link the two, when information is scarce, then copying something is the work of the mechanical image. However, when information is abundant, especially when it's overabundant, then seeing the original, picking its pattern out from the background, this is the work of machine vision. And today, many images are made for no one, but that does not mean that they are functionless. They are made by and for machines that, quote, see the world differently than we do. These machines do not have eyeballs, rods and cones, or visual cortex, but they do have sensors that detect light, motion, form, heat, and color in other ways. Vision evolved many times. Various photoreceptor cells found across the phyla may have evolved from many different chemoreceptors, and most likely well in advance of any brain-like information organs. Photosynthesis, of course, is a chemical response to light, and so in the broadest sense, it too could be considered as a kind of vision without images. Now, the animalian vision image-making nexus is primarily human, and it's likely that from the beginning to the end of the Holocene, that the total quantity of images that humans have produced, from cave walls to FaceTime, measured per year in total pounds of images, total gigabytes of information, continues to increase exponentially. And with digital imaging machines now in every person's pocket, the raw sum of images produced since the year 2000 is claimed to be more than all of those produced before that year. It depends, of course, on how you what you quantify as an image, quote unquote. But what Benjamin called mechanical reproducibility has certainly allowed images to proliferate far beyond the means of human craft. And in the last decade or two, vision has arguably evolved once more, this time not for birds or for cephalopods or rattlesnakes, but for inorganic species of machines that can see and make process images for people to see and for other machines to analyze. Today, industrial scale processing of data that has been gleaned by scanning the light spectrum in some way, from urban scale street surveillance to millimeter scale quality control along assembly lines, represents a significant fraction, arguably a majority, of all the work that the world does to image itself for the purpose of governing human society. At the end of the day, the machinic phylum takes more selfies than selves do. The function of representation, however, is rather different. The image, quote unquote, likely remains data and is never rendered to look like a picture because there's no need. An algorithm programmed to discern a particular pattern or anomaly can see it directly in the data itself. It does not necessarily need for that data to be projected, as if for a mammal, and then re-seen and reinterpreted back into code. Like algorithmic scanning and sorting of any large data set, the fact that the original source was and is visual is not so critical. So like plants, do machines also possess a kind of vision without images? Or at least a kind of image without natural abstraction toward and from the types of corporeal experience with which we're familiar. That is, an abstraction that is based in chemical or informational pattern finding, but not as a cartographic simulation of experience, rather as that experience. For example, some of the shapes printed on a dollar bill are there for humans to differentiate the value of one token from another. But far more are there for vision machine counterfeit detection and to verify that this is a, quote, real dollar. The piece of paper is full of machines that happen to look like pictures. It's an image as machine. Or a surveillance scan of a city may pick out one face from the thousands of motions, looking for the one true target. Elsewhere, we insert tiny camera probes into great paintings so as to verify that they are originals, as is often required by insurance companies backing purchasers. Online CAPTCHA software shows an image and then, by a quick inversion of the Turing Test, analyzes how the user interprets it and determines if they are in fact a real person. We conclude then that Benjamin's assurances regarding mechanical reproduction would undermine the aura of the original to be true when, for example, we compare a painting with a postcard of a painting. However, machine vision and images as machine are put to work to ensure erratic originals, verified non-fakes, true identities, unbroken versions, normal targets, and certified real deals. So a full revolution is made back around as the image is more fully technologized, as it becomes itself a machine. Benjamin's historical arc from pre-mechanical original to mechanical copy is incomplete without another curve, one leading now to a kind of machinic authentic. So the distribution of the sensible must include machine sensation. It must contextualize as well the sensibility of bipedal hominids among that larger array. Here among the algorithms, the winding evolution of vision returns to the primordial function of scanning the landscape and learning how to think in relation to that map. It's an issue of species, what is and is not like us, what is uniquely sentient, what is sapient. That's about the specificity of a species, and particularly about that geologic actor named by the Anthropocene. At least in the popular imagination, our still primitive understanding of genomics is beholden to pre-scientific notions of animal taxonomy and great chains of being. By convention, species equals discrete DNA, extinction equals subtraction of species, so extinction equals subtraction of discrete DNA. We are still arc makers. And yet, notwithstanding its epistemological stupidity, that project may prove to be valuable despite itself. We know that extinction means systems collapse more than the retirement of any one character in the show, but counting species remains a good unit measure of that systems collapse. And likewise, the systemic gathering and archiving of DNA in seed banks and in zoos may enable an eventual reseeding of the planet. This would not be an inversion of extinction and a restoration of the Holocene, but the cultivation of alternative ecosystems from these genetic codes. To do so will correspond with a different biophilosophy. Real biology doesn't conform to clean divisions between organism and species and landscape. We can find a single fungus organism that covers 2,384 acres. Under the sea, we observe siphonophores, creatures for which dozens of subcomponent organisms combine into what functions as a single composite body, some individuals handling locomotion, others eating and breathing. In the backyard, we encounter nematophora, such as horsehair worms, that take over insects and turn them into zombified prostheses. Everywhere, we are situated within economies of nested parasitism, that is, one species evolved to inhabit the body of another animal, often in necessary and symbiotic relationship. Not unlike a set of Russian dolls, a host caterpillar may contain a parasitic wasp larva, which in turn contains another larva, which is home to yet another larva, and so on, so that the caterpillar carries 5 parasites in total. It is not a it is a them. As for humans, we estimate more than 10,000 microbial species occupy the human ecosystem, and that inside your body, well over 99% of the genes are non-human. You too are a them, an identity which may challenge the neat coherency of the human as a geologic actor, in that our agency for the extinction of other species is actually a collaboration that we have undertaken with our actinobacteria, cyanobacteria, and proteobacteria. And in the long run, they may be the greater beneficiaries of the Holocene ecological collapse. This will depend on whether they can do better, whether they can better serve as nested parasites with the post-Anthropocenic species that we are now constructing. It is at best a paradoxical accomplishment to survive a mass extinction. The modern human species has the dubious distinction of not only observing and measuring mass extinction while it's happening, but also doing so with the understanding that it is one of the preeminent agents of the event. It does so, however, with the comfort that, one way or another, it too is unlikely to survive the bloody edge of the Anthropocenic intact. And as so much depart, what arrives? Simultaneous with a collapse of biodiversity, we also see at least the strong potential for an explosion of new species taking form through robotics, synthetic biology, and AI. We can't see the latter as replacements for the former, and yet there they are. And so perhaps like the small mammals that took over after the Cretaceous-Paleocene extinction, these are just better suited to the very different punctuated equilibrium to come. They may enjoy successes that we cannot, leaving us behind and stranded in place. Recall that the first Earthlings in space were not humans, and that a low percentage of all Earthlings in space have been humans. Human biology is needy and fragile. It's poorly suited to space travel, largely because we have to bring an entire ecosystem with us, from oxygen to radiation filters to the microbial biome in our intestines that help us digest food. As currently configured humans, we cannot really leave Earth because we have to bring a miniature Earth with us when we go. This is not true in the same way for other species which survive comparatively easily in space, such as metalloid robotics, and perhaps also some kind of synthetic biologies, and this guy, the tardigrade. What comes after Anthropocenic extinction, then? The only thing we can know about the post-Anthropocene is that it's an era in which humans are no longer the dominant geologic actor. These new Earthling species may prove to be more fit, better at making the next evolutionary steps than humans are, and so for us to survive, we may have to become more like them and less like what we are now. In the longer view, humans' role may be that of an enabling intermediary between early primates and as yet to emerge phyla that blend organic and inorganic flesh and thinking. This is the point of convergence between robust AI and the deep ecologies of voluntary human extinction. Instead of disappearing, however, we may survive by perforating the boundaries between animal, vegetable, and mineral. And in this light, once again, we see pleas to make technology serve humans and to suit human needs, desires, and requirements as misguided and even suicidal. Staring upon the abyss of mass extinction, a drearily common refrain, variously explicit or latent, is to identify, quote, modern technology as the main culprit, and to conclude that the most fundamental solution is to de-technologize the planet and to rehumanize ourselves, one presupposing the other in measure. This is among the worst possible plans, both philosophically and practically. First, it is tragically deaf to the priceless Copernican trauma of the anthropogenic precipice, that our status as the dominant geologic actor is fleeting, and that in order to survive, we will have to become something that is not necessarily and recognizably like the human today. Second, it props up a psychotic misrecognition of what humans, humanity, and humanism actually are. We are the brain-eating apes with weaponized hydrogen atoms, who organize our societies according to Bronze Age poetry on human sacrifice and ritual purification. Among the last projects to support is the rehumanization in any sense of a direct return to historical norms. I think the other species would agree. I'd like to conclude then with a few remarks specifically on the Anthropocene and the formulation of this subject as a geologic actor, and of the formulations to come. To do so, however, is harder than it should be. To pick two, Heideggerians and singularitarians, two groups with much more in common and than they think, and two with which I have ongoing frustrations, have made it unnecessarily difficult to think and talk about species and technology. They have made the inevitable whatever we want to do, or whether we want to do it or not, geoengineering project that really actually constitutes the eco-geopolitics for at least the 21st century, into something that is either disqualified a priori as a metaphysical atrocity, or as something that will simply sort itself out by the invisible hand of Moore's law. In the fetishization of the human experience, for one, and the psychotic proposition that the self is a stable physical entity that can be expanded exponentially without exploding into fractal plurality, for the other, they both make it far too difficult to see the geoengineering project for what it should be. More like molecular gastronomy at landscape scale, a restored and resorted ecology designed to taste itself in new forms of richly spiced and imaginatively sauced mutual ingestion. I would also argue that the post-Anthropocene is a kind of subtractive modernity, in which composition may be articulated by what it removes from the plane and from the archive. At the same time that I'm pro-nanotech, biotech, nuclear, solar tech, space exploration, habitation, what Benedict Tingle calls maximum jailbreak, I also think the people who are the most visible and official public advocates for each of these technologies are too often clowns. And we must save these techniques from those people and their hideous languages. I believe that delinking microecologies, deglobalization, and decarbonization are not the opposite of platformization or acceleration or what Ed Keller calls post-planetarity. These are not opposites, but they're actual means of it. The best and probably only way to actually expand material intelligence is through a kind of exoplanetary exploration. And the best and probably only way to do that is through decarbonization. And the best and perhaps only way to get to decarbonization is through splitting and fusing the nucleus of atoms, solar capture and solar expenditure, both the heliotechnical and the geotechnical, and the molecular technical, what we call nano. As said, however, there are some, however, who observe the same Anthropocenic precipice and demand what amounts to a linear reversal, an atavistic, irredentist, and recidivist return to a prelapsarian equilibrium. Let's all forget the math. There are some, perhaps even lurking among you, who will insinuate from the moral and phenomenological authenticity of ascetic and aesthetic withdrawal, fetishizing immediacy as the enemy of abstraction, tribal sovereignty, a parochial vernacular of means above all, of nature and clan, blood and soil, the survival of a judgment, wargaming ecstatic deprivation like teenage monks. But it is through the recursive loop of planetary scale computational epistemologies that we confront and conceive the deep time of media and geology in the first place. What we know about our ecological crises, planetary metasystems, chemical temporalities, disruptions, chthonic disequilibria, and so on, is through the most complex and capital-intensive, as well as cognitive and chemical-intensive technologies we've ever devised. Getting to a better comprehension of the geophysical duration of the raw chemical becoming of the matter that becomes in turn the substance of our own computational hardware may only be possible in the immediate term through an even more expansive and more fine granular application of these same systems: sensors array, nano-diagnostic protocols, thermal imaging, multivariate calculated models, based on better input-output variables and knowledges and our intended outcomes. To make knowing the deepest time of the media more possible at this moment, it is, in other words, only available for and through that media itself. And in this, the race to build that machine that can best know the planet may still be the thing that, in turn, destroys that planet. But then, leading from this, knowing time for who or for what. Chemical time and the time of radioactive decay are, we assume, objective. They proceed without phenomenological observation, and this is the point of them. However, should deeper time of media come together as a disposition of knowing with and through some other intelligence, it would do so for that intelligence, wouldn't it? Put differently, chemistry is chemistry, but the knowing of time is always a knowing for some temporally sensitive knower. But the computational self-awareness we have for our condition may be a precondition of other non-transcendent, very imminent forms of synthetic intelligence, not to us or for us. This isn't about mastery and closure, but about abdication and erasure. And that possibility is almost like a Rorschach blot, signaling how one feels about the idea that unthinkable alterity may be imminent in the most onerous of megasystems, despite of or because of how they are programmed to do the opposite. This is the referendum. For me personally, it's not really about the future per se, if that means about what is next or what is new, because I don't really believe in these. I think change in the local scale of centuries and continents is better seen as the chemical recomposition of the same earthly archive, save the genuine innovations of planetary trauma like asteroids and volcanoes and species collapse. So I think, along with Lebbe's Woods, that we must think and design with catastrophe and trauma, instead of on behalf of the normalization of emergencies. That's the post-Copernican thing to do. I think the next machine, the one that comes after computation, and the next economics may be simultaneous arrivals. For some, the eclipse of capital must be achieved before the next machine, or even the next economics can be directly entertained. And for others, it's the inverse. This may be one of the places where the room is split in its eschatologies. Perhaps a bit like the pre- and post-millenarian schism in fundamentalist Christian circles about whether or not the Antichrist comes before or after the rapture or whatever. I would invest my chemistry in the post-Anthropocene, the geologic era after the human one, even if it's hastening it were not a dire necessity. And I would insist that there's nothing nihilistic about my meltdown, thanks very much, because along with William Burroughs and Brian Geisen, I take it that we are here to go. Meaning both we are here in order to go somewhere else, or at least to get out of our own skins. We are here in order to leave and disappear, not just for survival, but to transform the default settings up to and beyond their dissipation and replacement by other things that are imminent within the world and waiting to appear. Thank you.